and I've called it Powerful Pedagogy Post-Pandemics. And you will notice that there is an S on the word pandemics. And some people are thinking, well, wait a minute. You know, I thought we just had one, but I hope to illuminate that a little better as the lecture proceeds. Lynn did a great job of telling you who I am. Professor Emerita is just a fancy way of saying I'm retired, but I will tell you that I am failing at retirement because I'm probably working harder now than I have in some time. I am indeed the past president of the National Academy of Education, a fellow of the British Academy, a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a fellow of the American Educational Research Association, and a fellow of the Hagler Institute at Texas A&M University. So all of this work actually keeps me quite busy. I want to start this lecture, however, talking about a tale of 4 pandemics. Now, I'm sure someone is saying, what do you mean 4? You know, we did everything we could do to just deal with one. Well, and that's the one you know about. COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, the novel coronavirus, no matter what it's called, you are all familiar with this particular pandemic. It has shut the world down. It has meant that I could not have a lovely visit in Hong Kong, which was the original plan when Professor Goodwin and I first started talking. So we know that one. But I want to suggest that there are others. There is what I would call a pandemic of violence and war throughout the world. These pictures are actually from the Ukraine, and you might be saying, well, you know, Professor Ladson-Billings, that's there, that's not here. I want to suggest to you that this level of violence impacts us all, whether it is a matter of the way that supply chain was interrupted so that you could not get wheat out of Ukraine, whether it is about the level of oil and gas prices. So violence anywhere has a pandemic-like quality to us. So I wanted to make sure I put that there. There's also this pandemic of impending environmental catastrophe. These are pictures from the fires of the Western United States, California, Oregon, and Washington have been deeply impacted. But the truth of the matter is we are seeing the climate change everywhere. It's not just the West Coast of the United States. There are more floods. We just saw Pakistan experience some of the worst flooding in its monsoon season that it has ever experienced. And I will tell you that climate change is one of the things that our students are most interested in, they're most concerned about. There was a study done by the University of Bath that surveyed 25,000 young people internationally, ages 16 through 20. And the number one concern is the environment. And linked to that concern is their fear that the adults in the room, people like you and I, will not do anything about it. And then a final pandemic is really what's happening to the international monetary markets, the economies. So even though we in the United States might be, bemoaning things like inflation and failure to people to make a living wage, we know that our economies are interconnected. If people in the Western Hemisphere don't purchase things, often people in the Eastern Hemisphere cannot work because they're not asked to make things. And you might be saying, well, why are you putting all these pandemics up here and all this gloom and doom? Well, 2 reasons. Number one, our young people are concerned about these things. It's not as if they are outside of what's happening in the world. So they come to school bringing these concerns with them. But secondly, I wanted to present them because that's just one side of the story. I think there is a more optimistic, more hopeful side of the story that we haven't talked about. And I draw that optimism and hope from the work of this woman, who is an Indian novelist by the name of Arundhati Roy. She wrote a wonderful, wonderful essay, and I hope you will take the time to search for it. It is pretty easy to find online. And it's called The Pandemic is a Portal. And let me just share with you a piece of that essay that just really sparked my interest and curiosity. She says, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or, that's the operative word, or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. That gives me hope that just because things on the other side of the pandemic weren't what we wanted, doesn't mean we can't make another world. Doesn't mean we can't change some of the things that we have been doing. So I talk about the notion of an education reset. And when I talk about this notion of resetting, I'm arguing, I am pleading with my colleagues, let's not go back to normal. You know, that's a very often repeated phrase. We always say, oh, can't wait till things get back to normal. But the truth of the matter is that normal was not a good state for a lot of our students. Normal was not a place they want to go back to. We had certain students who were over-identified for special needs and special education. We had some students for whom school was a horrible experience. We had some students for whom school just meant more failure. So I want to argue that we want to reset our education. That's part of the new side of this portal that we want to engage in. So, well, what does it mean to reset? So I put this picture here because I know these devices are very familiar to each and every one of them. Everybody has a cell phone or mobile phone. They are ubiquitous. They are everywhere. You wouldn't dream of leaving your house without your cell phone. But because they are machines, there are sometimes when they don't do what we want them to do. And so when they don't act exactly the way we'd like them to act, we try a few things. We might, for example, just shut it off, wait a few minutes, and then turn it back on. If that doesn't fix whatever the problem is, we might pull out the SIM card, and blow on it, make sure there's no dust. Put it back in, start it up again. And if that doesn't fix it, we might take out the battery, make sure that the battery contacts are good and things are doing what they're supposed to do. If that doesn't fix it, some of us are ambitious enough to go online and look for a help group, right? So we look for a tech group. Maybe someone else has had this same problem. But if none of that helps us, we will take ourselves down to the place where we purchased our mobile device. You may have to go to the Apple store, or you may go to an Android store or to your cell phone provider. And someone, typically a young person, because that's who really understands these technologies, may do exactly the same kinds of things you did to reset. But if that doesn't happen, they will look to you and say some words that I call the kiss of death. In other words, they may look at you and say, I think it's time for a hard reset. Now, why do I call it the kiss of death? Because I'm terrible about backing up the data on my phone. So what that means is if they reset it, some of the things that I haven't backed up are going to go away. You know, all those little food pictures I took when I went to a fancy restaurant, they're going away. Some of my latest contacts, because I didn't back them up, I'm going to lose them. What you're going to get as a result of a hard reset is a device that looks a lot like it looked when you first got it. It is a kind of clean slate. So that's something that I'm arguing we may have to do in education if what we want to do is to not just go back to normal, but be on the other side of this portal that Arundhati Roy has suggested. Now, I wish I could tell you that I was smart enough to have come up with this notion of the reset all by myself. But before going into the academy, I used to be a history teacher. So I always seem to take lessons from history. And there are a couple things that I recall. Two pictures here that are, for me, lessons from history. On the left side is post-World War II Japan. On the right side is post-World War II Italy. What you know about these two nations is they were both on the losing end of World War II. They were part of the Axis powers in alliance with Germany. Well, after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it's not as if the Japanese people said, oh, well, that's over, let's just go back to school. No, they realized that they had to begin to think differently about educating their young people. So one of the things that you will see in the history of Japanese education is an uptick in providing services for girls in Japan. Prior to World War II, not so much. Another innovation that they instituted after World War II, another part of what I call their reset, was a change in organizations. And so you began to see them not just have elementary and secondary schools, but look to the West and begin to create what we call middle schools. So they definitely took the opportunity after the devastation of the war to change some things. They didn't just go back to normal. On the right, you have a picture from Italy in the Reggio Emilia preschool, undoubtedly one of the best preschool models in the world. But that model comes out of the people of Italy saying, we don't ever want to be blindly following fascists. Now, I don't know how that lines up with their recent election, but at this point, right after World War II, they were saying, we want to have young people who can think for themselves, who can problem solve, who will not be blindly led around by someone just because they're charismatic. And so the Emilia Reggio schools began to do just that with very young children. I will tell you that in the US, we often send teacher education candidates who are going to be working in early childhood to Emilia Reggio. We want them to see this model. So again, I didn't come up with the idea of the reset on my own. I looked at what had been done historically. So yes, we have had this chance to just kind of come to a full stop, if you will. And my question is, really, are we going to take advantage of this chance to start again? So I knew I was talking to folks at the education faculty and affiliates at the University at Hong Kong. And so I wanted to ask myself, what's actually normal for Hong Kong? If you're talking about, if I'm saying let's not go back to normal, what's normal for Hong Kong? Well, you are modeled after the UK English system in general. You're rated second by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, right after Singapore. and you're rated third by the Global Index of Cognitive Skills and Educational Attainment, right after Finland and South Korea. So maybe what you may be saying is, well, you know, Professor Ladson-Billings, yes, you guys have all these problems in the US, but we're doing pretty good here in Hong Kong. And you're right. You look really good in international comparisons. So the question becomes, why would we change? We look, you know, we're looking this good, you know, and on one measure, there's only one nation ahead of us, one school system ahead of us, that's Singapore. And on the other, there are only two, Finland and South Korea. Why would we change? Well, turns out when we talk to your students, they have a different viewpoint of their schooling experience. On a 5-point scale, students in Hong Kong rank their education as a 2. So that's on the low end of the scale. 70% of your students think your schools are too focused on, quote, academic performance. Now that may seem oxymoronic, since that's what schools are supposed to do, is prepare people for academic performance. But I think you have students who think there's more to life than just studying. 65% of your students think that your schools deliver what they call a spoon-fed education. In other words, they're just being given information. They're not asked to think about things. They're not asked to evaluate. They're not asked to apply. They're just asked to take it in and regurgitate it out. 57% of your students believe that your schools have an overly competitive atmosphere. In other words, rather than learning to cooperate with each other, that the very ethos of your schooling is about competition. 54% of your students decry the lack of choice regarding assessments. In other words, there's only one way to assess. You have to take the test. And yet, with all we know about developments in assessment now, there's other ways to demonstrate learning. 47% of your students believe that there is an overemphasis on elitism. In other words, the whole point is to get into the, quote, best universities. And then half of your students believe that student suicide is directly related to school pressures. And that, to me, is one of the real things that, you know, it's like 50% of your students. That jumped out at me. Because what's the point of being number 2 or number 3 if your students are struggling with sort of mental health issues to the extent that they don't even want to live? So there are, I think, a few reasons why you might consider changing or making some changes. Well, you can't change your practice until you change your theory. You have a theory of learning that is about rote learning and repetition and test assessment. You're not going to change your practice. You're going to keep moving in that direction. And your practice is linked to how you think about the learners, about their parents or caregivers and their communities and their culture. You think that certain kids are going to be, outstanding. Your practice is linked to that. If you think that some kids just can't get it, they don't have the resources, or you don't think that them to be smart enough, your practice will reflect that. And your practice is really an extension of how you believe people learn. Fortunately, I think in most of Asia, there is a belief that students' effort is what determines their outcome. Nothing innate about them. So that means you at least have students coming to school under the tutelage of teachers who believe they actually can learn. And your practice will not change just because you receive new curriculum materials or strategies. You will figure out a way, even if you get some of the most innovative materials. If you believe the way that students learn is that you just kind of get it in them somehow and they've got to memorize it, you're going to do that to those materials. So my work has primarily been around a concept called culturally relevant pedagogy. And I'm going to give you a sort of shorthand, quick and dirty explanation of it. You may have seen it in this work, the Dreamkeepers, which is actually now in a third iteration. So there's a third edition of this book. Or if you're kind of an education research nerd like me, you may have seen it in that the American Educational Research Journal, which got published initially in 1995. So it's interesting that I published that in 95, and then just this year, a third edition of Dreamkeepers has come out. So what is this culturally relevant pedagogy? Well, imagine an equilateral triangle. And I say equilateral because I know it means equal sides and equal angles. So what's on those equal sides and angles? Well, this notion of academic achievement, but more specifically, student learning. So even though your students complain that there's too much emphasis on academic achievement, it's important. And it is important in a theory of culturally relevant pedagogy. In addition, there is a notion of cultural competence. And I'm going to go through each of these with a little bit more detail. But the idea that our young people come to school with culture. Right now, I understand in Hong Kong, you're having a shift from a sort of English dominant to moving towards Cantonese. Some students may already be there, other students may not. And then finally, this notion of socio-political or kind of critical consciousness, the ability to solve real life problems, not made up problems or problems that are in a textbook, but problems that students are grappling with. I started out talking about their concerns about the environment. So that might be one of those critical consciousness developments that students are interested in. So let me kind of quickly run through each of these individually. When we think about supporting student learning, in some ways it's a no-brainer. It's like, isn't that what we're supposed to do as teachers? Isn't that what we're supposed to do with students? But we often have debates over how deep do we go into a subject matter versus how much do we cover? And a lot of us as teachers are rushing through a syllabus. We are rushing through a curriculum. We are rushing through a textbook because we think we have to cover everything. Even if students don't actually understand things, we want to be able to say, I covered all the material. I think we need to rethink this notion of just making sure we cover material. Also want to dispel the notion that having a high failure rate means your course is rigorous. Not so. Having a high failure rate might just mean you're not a very good teacher. Students should be able to master what it is that we are presenting them with. It is at an appropriate grade level and it's an appropriate depth. They should be able to master it. We shouldn't have 60, 70% of kids failing anything that we are teaching. So that means we're going to move from a vision of what we do. We're going to move from the vision of a sieve. That is, we put everybody in at the top and we push, push, push. And only the ones that come out on the bottom are deemed as worthy. That's the system that we have had in the US for a long time. That only the ones who make it through the exams, that make it through the assessments, are the ones that are worthy. The ones that get left inside that sieve, we kind of just toss to the side. I want to move away from that metaphor and use the metaphor of a net. The idea that we want to catch every single student. I often will say to my students, can you imagine first responders, firefighters, for example, getting called to a fire and having a mindset that says, well, let's go see if we can save some people. No, firefighters go with the intent to save everybody. Now, maybe they don't actually do that, but that's their intent, to save everyone. That should be our intent as teachers. We should want to catch every single student, not let anyone go by the wayside. Around the issue of cultural competence, this is what I would call the most misunderstood aspect of culturally relevant pedagogy. Because it is the ability to be firmly grounded in one's own culture of origin while becoming fluent in at least one other culture. So our students should all leave school bilingual. They should be able to speak their home language or their own main language, but they ought to be able to be facile in another language. Our young people will not have the luxury of living in just culturally encapsulated spaces. The technologies that we have today, the internet, the social media platforms, all put us in touch with one another. So we want our students to be culturally competent, no matter what their first culture is. We want them to be able to embrace and understand people from other cultures. And then for this notion of socio-political or critical consciousness, you may not recognize this picture, but this is Thomas Jefferson, who was the third president of the United States. And Jefferson said the following: above all things, I hope the education of the common people will be attended to, convinced that on their good sense we may rely with the most security for a preservation of a due degree of liberty. Now, that may sound nice to you, but certainly doesn't sound radical. But can I tell you, in the 1700s, when he made this statement, it was a radical statement because no one thought about educating the so-called common people. The only people who received education were rich people's kids because they could afford to educate them. We didn't have a public school system. So for Jefferson to make this radical statement that everybody ought to be educated, the common people ought to be educated, because it's going to be their responsibility to make sure we remain a democracy, is a radical statement. So what does that have to do with the young people that you teach? If we don't teach these young people to think for themselves, to solve the problems that they are confronted with, then what are we doing? Our very futures rest in their hands. So it is student learning, it is cultural competence, and it is a critical consciousness, the ability to sort of think through problems that make up this thing that I've called culturally relevant pedagogy. Well, I started this work back in the late 1980s. And now I feel like we're at a place where there's been kind of an evolution of the theory. So I often ask this question, and of course I can't see you because we're in a webinar format, but I often ask people, how many of you are on Twitter? I think if I were to see you today, I might ask, how many are you on TikTok? And why do I ask that question? Because that's the place where our young people are. Whether we're out there or not, young people are. Unfortunately, when I go in schools, I see signs like this that essentially say no mobile devices. And I try to help teachers and administrators understand they're not phones. They are indeed computers that most of our young people have in their backpacks and in their pockets more computing power than I experienced when I was finishing up my doctoral degree. They can find out so much information. And indeed, if you were to check their phone logs, you would see they don't actually make that many calls. They are texting, they are scrolling through websites, they are on social media platforms. This is an essential device for them. And unfortunately, we haven't figured out how to use them appropriately in the classroom. So often what we just say is no cell phones. I will tell you that as someone who has taught a lot of international graduate students, the cell phone has been a saving grace. I've turned my classes into, I create a hashtag for my classes. And so I say to students, you don't have to raise your hand, but you can talk to me via Twitter. Many of my international students have been shy about speaking. They're not totally confident in their English speaking skills. But once they learned they could communicate on Twitter, oh, they became full participants in the classroom. So the technology was a wonderful addition to the work we're trying to do. Today, the new digital divide is not one of rich versus poor or Black versus white in our cases, but really it's one of young versus old, because most of our young people are very, very fluent in the technologies that we are confronted with. It's us old folks who don't understand the technology and don't know what to do with it. So back in 1989, when I discovered these teachers that I call Dreamkeepers, what I saw a lot was a focus on cultural history where they would reveal the things to students that their textbooks omitted. I saw a focus on community issues, things like urban renewal or veterans concerns or homelessness because of the community that I was collecting my data in. But there was a limited focus on student culture. I had one teacher who actually used some rap lyrics to teach poetry to her kids, but most of the teachers didn't really pull on the students' culture. So that's kind of a shortcoming in, I think, in my work, that we didn't pay better or closer attention to the role of student culture. Today, for someone to be what I would call a dream keeper, they would need to include popular culture in their understanding of culture. They would need to recognize an art form that we call hip hop, which is a universal, worldwide art form. They need to recognize its longevity and its power. And they need to catch up with Madison Avenue, that is the advertising people. They've known all along that there was something special about youth culture. So take a look at this commercial, this advertisement. Look at the date, 1992. And here is a cereal commercial that uses.
You watch me get Fred's Fruity Pebbles.
Who are you?
I'm the master rapper and I'm here to sing. I love Fruity Pebbles in a major way.
He loves Fruity Pebbles in a major way.
The bedrock yellow, orange, purple, lime, and red. But to get the fruity taste, I gotta trick Fred. Fruity.
To get the fruity taste, he's got to trick Fred. Barney.
Guess that's a wrap.
Post Fruity Pebbles cereal, part of this nutritious breakfast. Yabba-dabba delicious.
So somehow, Post cereals figured out we can sell our product by leveraging students' interest in this hip hop culture. And, you know, if I had plenty of time with you, I could help kind of deconstruct all the elements of hip hop that they put into this little brief segment, this brief commercial that would attract buyers. That was 1992. I want to suggest to you that Madison Avenue still gets it. Take a look at this advertisement.
You watch me.
Hello? Yeah. I can't find it. I'm looking for it right now. One second.
They say quit, they say done. They say we're too grown for fun. They say old, we say young. We say playful's never done. Don't fight the feeling, just let it flow. Stack it up, rack it up, let it go. Laughter is calling, pick up the phone. Let's stay playful, Oreo. Everyone's welcome, don't need a label. If we're still smiling, the future's bueno. I got a secret the world should know. Let's stay playful, Oreo.
Hello? Psych.
And when you do, every day's full. For every moment, we're grateful. No half, our glass glass on the way full. Yeah, yup, stay playful.
So here's Nabisco Company using a popular rapper, Wiz Khalifa, to sell Oreos. They figured out one of the ways to reach the audience, to reach their consumers, is to leverage this youth culture, hip hop arts, to begin to sell their products. So things have changed, and youth culture has become a much more significant and important aspect of how young people learn. So, what does all this mean in this sort of post-COVID-19 world? We're on the other side of this portal. What does it mean? Well, I have a series of questions that I want to go through with you. And I start with the question, remember what happened post-Katrina? You may not, because it's local to the US, but after that devastating hurricane, lots of people wanted to get back to normal. Remember what I said about normal? Well, normal in New Orleans were terrible schools. And so the community was like, no, we don't want to get back to that. Unfortunately, folks who had a different agenda said, you know what, we can make money off of this. And what has happened in New Orleans is that there is essentially no school system. There is an entire charter network of schools. There are no public schools. So you cannot assume because you don't do anything different after a tragedy that somebody else doesn't have something else in mind to do. What are our changed assumptions as a result of the pandemic? For example, who do we now believe can have access to digital devices? Before the pandemic, at least in the US, there were certain kids who would say, no, we can't trust them. They're not going to bring the computers back. They'll destroy the Chromebooks. Now we understood, you know what, you have to make sure all students have access to these devices. Or a question of how important are the tests? We went an entire year with no tests, no assessment. It wasn't the end of the world. And I'm not suggesting that there should be no tests, but I think we have to ask the question, how important are they? What is the role of social emotional learning in our students' mental health needs? One of the biggest lessons of COVID in my mind is that relationships matter. Our kids didn't miss getting math packets. They didn't miss doing chemistry experiments. They missed relating to their peers and caring adults. And so then how do we begin to rethink education? Do we finally understand education to be bigger than schooling? That education can happen in places outside of the school? Education can happen at times and in ways that are very different than the way that we structure school? These are just questions that I'm throwing out here. For each of the pillars or the sides of the triangle that I shared with you, I have another set of questions. So what does post-COVID-19 student learning look like? So here's the question. What actually counts as learning? Is it only the things that you put on a test? Is it only the things that students can recite? Or is learning much more complex? How do we determine what students know versus what they have? What do I mean by this? If students are from an affluent family that has resources, are we evaluating the fact that they have these resources so they can bring these things to school and demonstrate certain things that other students can't? Again, can we finally put the tests in their proper perspective? I am not an anti-test person. I think the tests tell us something. I just don't think they tell us everything. One of the things that happened at US universities is that most of them admitted students without test scores because of COVID. And I can tell you at the University of Wisconsin, we did not admit an inferior class. We looked at more robustly at things like students' grades and the courses they took and the activities they were engaged in, their community service. And we were able to admit a class that was equal to or better than any other class we admitted, but we didn't have any test scores. And then can we measure academic progress versus just some fixed external standards? What do I mean by this? If we look at where youngsters enter our classes in the beginning of a school year, and then measure where they end, isn't that a little bit more important than how they look next to just some standard that comes from the state? So I think it is important that we actually measure how they progress, how much they learn over the course of a year. What about this notion of cultural competence that I talked about? How is it impacted by COVID-19? Well, I've raised this with you with the examples from the videos. What is the role of youth culture? In other words, what can we learn from young people that we can incorporate in their learning? What's the role of socioeconomic differences? Do poorer kids struggle on certain things that kids who are solidly middle class don't struggle on? And how do we help teachers understand the disparity that young people may be faced with and what that may mean for their ability to perform in the classroom? And finally, what's the role of digital literacy? See, one of the cultures that we kind of forget to talk about is what I would call technological cultures. You know, how do these devices shape the way in which our young people interact, develop relationships, think, you know, all of these things I think are important as we are going in this sort of post-COVID, on the other side of the portal moment. And then around critical consciousness, what kind of questions do we actually need to engage as we think about improving our schools? How do we help the public understand the changing needs of schools? Now, I don't know exactly what happened in your part of the world when COVID-19 hit and you had to close down schools, but one of the very first things that we did in the US, most school districts did this, is we started feeding people. Because many of our kids got their lunch. They got 5 meals a week in school, Monday through Friday. We fed kids. And then we realized by closing down the schools, they were missing these meals. So instead of sending them math packets or reading assignments or science things to be working on, we sent food, because that was the big need. And that's another thing I think is a lesson from COVID-19, is that you have to meet people's basic needs. I asked a question about, for what SEL or social emotional learning do we prepare? We've been talking a lot about social emotional learning, but we often are talking about it from the standpoint of kids who already have resources, and that we just got to get them to sort of calm down and get into a very, placid and state where they can be comfortable. But maybe for some kids, what needs to happen is that they need to be able to talk to a caring adult, that they need to be able to share their concerns. And that links to my final question here is, how do we help students cope with what I've called pandemic trauma? Now, how's pandemic trauma different from just social emotional learning? Some of our students have had to deal up close with death. In the United States, 200,000 parents of school-aged children died from COVID-19. Think about that. And I would just make a rough guess if you said that the average number of kids in a US household is 2, okay? We know there are people who have fewer and people who have a lot more, but let's just say 2. Then we're talking close to 500,000 children who go to school every day and don't have a parent. And schools are organized around parents. We have parents sign permission slips or sign report cards. We have parents participate in all kinds of things. And yet these kids have to persevere, come to school with this degree of trauma. Now, some people will say, well, kids have experienced death before. It's not the end of the world. I agree that a lot of our kids have seen death up close. What's different, however, is because of the pandemic, they did not have the rituals that are associated with death. They had funeral directors say that only 7 people can be in a funeral home, or ministers say only 10 people can be at the church, or there'd be some discussion about at a gravesite, you can only have 20 people who have to be separated wearing masks. Our kids have had to absorb that trauma. They've had to make sense of it and yet show up at school. So these are a series of questions that I think are important for us to think about as we think about pandemics, the pedagogy that we need in pandemics. I want to wrap up with an example of how differently we could be doing schooling by showing you an example of some work of a young man that I actually had the opportunity to teach.
Neighborhoods are ovens with windows. And as the knob on global warming increases, lives are preheated until a soul souffles. Pancake stack projects are poured over with a humid as thick as molasses. Heat and humidity are the perfect appetizer on death's plate. It's an all-you-can-eat buffet from May to October, and senior citizen discount is every day. If thermometers can measure temperatures, they should be able to measure human anxiety. As the temperature rises, we reach boiling points. Attitudes of those around us rise quicker than mercury, and the pressure of staying cool causes us to explode. Compressed living complexes circulate heat and cause compressed feelings to converge upon our neighbors in the hood. So that 90% release of excess body heat talked about in science class is contributed to our local temperature rising. We crack open fire hydrants until we hear lights crying, raising taxes by lowering our body temperature. And if you couldn't afford a wind replacer, fridges and freezers were propped open until your 2 brothers' faces are frozen. Audiences applaud the ice cream man once that familiar jingle mingles with our ears. This sweet release of flooded heat is a godsend. But what do you know? The ice cream vendor's name is Noah. As the temperature rises, so do attitudes, death rates, bills, and ice cream stocks. Heat affects the elderly more than it does us. Their lungs resemble the Dow Exchange, rises and drops until they crash. Ambulances are summoned, riding down the street flooded with the contents of the only fire hydrant. We have only just begun to fry.
So I like to think of this as an example of a culturally relevant student project. Clearly, there was student learning. There was some academic achievement. He learned about the climate and the way that climate impacts the elderly, as well as other things. He also had a kind of cultural competence there, because what you saw in those images all come from his community. They're not sort of the standard middle class, this is the way life is. This is his community in Milwaukee, in which he is sharing to show you the points he's trying to make. And then finally, it is a kind of critical consciousness because he's asking a question about why is it, why is it the average temperature hotter and higher in these communities where folks are forced to live closer together, that the disparities that exist. Now, someone might say, well, that's good. He did this project, that it's interesting. Well, I will tell you, this is about a 7 or 8 year old video. This young man has finished his degree in environmental sciences, and he is a climate scientist today. So he took something that he was deeply interested in, put it in a format that reflects his own background and experience, but ultimately studied the science he needed to study, that by the end of the 4-year degree at the University of Wisconsin, he was able to work in the field of environmental studies. So I think I've probably exhausted my time. I'm going to end here. Let me stop the share.